Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to try to answer a really interesting question. How do we know if the results of a study are actually telling us anything useful?
It's a great question and one that researchers grapple with all the time.
We'll be diving into episode 5 of Significant Talk with Dr. Hamdi Al-Hakimi to help us break this down. He talks about 4 possible explanations for what we see in research.
And it's kind of like we're playing detective here. We have these clues from the study, but how do we know if those clues are actually leading us in the right direction or if there's something else going on behind the scenes?
Exactly. The episode lays out 4 key possibilities, and the first one is bias. Imagine you're reading a study that says snuff dipping is linked to oral cancer. Seems pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, that's what you'd think. But bias is a bit like a hidden thumb on the scale. It's a systematic error in how the study was designed or conducted that can really throw off the results. It's like having a wonky scale that always tips in one direction, so you never get an accurate weight.
So even if the researchers are trying their best to be objective, bias can still sneak in.
Oh, absolutely. Even well-designed studies can have bias, and the episode uses a classic example to illustrate this. A case control study in England about smoking and lung cancer.
Oh, I remember reading about that one. The researchers compared people with lung cancer to a control group of people who didn't have lung cancer.
Right, and that seems reasonable, but here's where it gets really interesting. The control group actually smoked more than the general population.
So the control group wasn't actually a good representation of people without lung cancer.
Exactly. They weren't truly representative, and this difference in smoking habits could have actually made the link between smoking and lung cancer seem weaker than it really was.
Wow. So that one little detail about who was in the control group can have a huge impact on how we interpret the results. It really highlights how important it is to carefully examine who's being studied in the first place.
You got it. And that's just one type of bias called selection bias. There's also measurement bias, which can come up if there are issues with how data is collected. Imagine a survey about eating habits where the questions are kind of confusing or lead people to answer a certain way.
That would definitely throw things off.
Right. It can really muddy the findings.
So it's not just about who the participants are, but it's also about the tools and methods used to gather the information, right? We need to be asking, could there be any errors in how they measured things?
Exactly. We always have to consider whether the methods were reliable and accurate. Now, are you ready to tackle the second possibility, which can be a bit tricky to wrap our heads around? It's called confounding.
Ooh, yes, bring on the challenge. I'm ready to put on my detective hat for this one.
Perfect. So let's say our study finds that people who drink a lot of coffee are more likely to get lung cancer. Does that mean coffee is the villain here? Not necessarily. There could be a hidden player messing things up, and that's what we call a confounder.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. Walk me through it.
Well, think about it. People who drink a lot of coffee might also be more likely to smoke.
Right.
And we know that smoking is a major risk factor for lung cancer. In this case, smoking is the confounder because it's related to both coffee drinking and lung cancer.
So it's kind of like a tangled web where coffee drinking and lung cancer are connected, but smoking is the real string pulling them together.
A perfect analogy. To be a true confounder, a variable has to be linked to both the exposure, in this case coffee drinking, and the outcome, which is lung cancer. It can't just be related to one or the other.
This is making me wonder, how do researchers even begin to untangle these webs of relationships and figure out what's really going on?
Yeah, that's the tricky part. It really comes down to careful study design and statistical analysis. Researchers try to identify potential confounders up front and control for them in their analysis, but sometimes those hidden players can still slip through the cracks.
So listeners, next time you come across a study, channel your inner detective. Ask yourself, what other factors could be at play here? Are there any potential confounders that aren't being accounted for?
That's the question to ask. Now, are you ready for the third possibility? We need to talk about the role of chance. Even with the best study design in the world, sometimes the results we see are just random variation.
Just like flipping a coin and getting 10 heads in a row doesn't mean the coin is rigged, just that random things happen.
Exactly. That's why researchers use statistical tools like p-values to figure out how likely it is that their findings are just a fluke.
So a tiny p-value would suggest that the results are probably not just random chance.
You got it. But it's important to remember that even a tiny p-value doesn't 100% guarantee that the association is real. That's why researchers also use something called confidence intervals, which gives a range of plausible values for the true effect, taking into account the fact that there's always going to be some uncertainty in the data.
So it's like saying, we're pretty sure that the true effect lies somewhere within this range, but we can't pinpoint it exactly.
That's a great way to think about it. And that's why it's so important to look for consistent findings across multiple studies. That helps minimize the impact of chance and gives us a more reliable picture of the true relationship. Don't get too excited or too discouraged by just one study.
It's like the old saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Welcome back. We've been carefully going through the possible reasons for those interesting study results you've been thinking about. We talked about bias, where systematic errors can sneak in, and confounding, those hidden players that can make things messy. We even touched on the idea of chance sometimes. Things in research just happen randomly.
Right. It's really making me realize that understanding research is so much more than just reading the conclusion and accepting it as fact. There's a whole lot of critical thinking involved. I'm excited to dig into that fourth possibility, the true association. This is what everyone is hoping for when they do a study, right?
Absolutely. A true association is what researchers are always searching for, that solid link between two things. But as we've been discussing, it's not always easy to prove. Just because two things seem connected doesn't automatically mean one causes the other.
We've been talking about that example with snuff dipping and oral cancer. I'm curious, how do researchers move beyond just association to actually saying that one thing might be causing another?
That's a really great question. The episode talks about criteria that researchers use to try and figure out the likelihood of a causal relationship. And one of the most important ones is temporal relationship. This means that whatever is causing the problem has to happen before the outcome. So it wouldn't make sense to say that oral cancer is what causes someone to start dipping snuff.
Right, the cause has to come before the effect. But how can researchers be sure about the timing, especially when they're looking back in time? People's memories can be pretty unreliable.
You're exactly right. Relying on people's memories can definitely be problematic. That's why researchers often prefer to use what's called prospective cohort studies. In these studies, the researchers start with a group of people who don't have the outcome they're interested in. So in our example, they wouldn't have oral cancer, and then they track these people over a long period of time.
So they would find a group of snuff dippers, a group of non-dippers, and make sure everyone is healthy at the start. Then they would see who ends up developing oral cancer over time.
Exactly. By watching who develops the disease and who doesn't, they can establish that really important temporal relationship. It's almost like watching a story unfold in real time rather than trying to piece things together after the fact.
That makes a lot of sense. By starting with healthy individuals, it eliminates that whole chicken or the egg problem of which came first.
Exactly. That's one of the real strengths of these cohort studies. They're super useful for investigating cause and effect. But temporal relationship is just one part of the whole picture. The episode also talks about a bunch of other criteria for causation, right?
Yeah. What are some of those other things that researchers are on the lookout for?
Well, there's consistency with other studies. Do multiple studies, all using different methods and different groups of people, point towards the same conclusion? If so, that makes the case for a causal link much stronger. It's like having a whole bunch of witnesses all backing up the same story.
It's like a whole research choir singing the same tune, rather than just one study making a claim.
You got it. Another important criterion is the strength of the association. A really strong association is much more likely to be causal than a weak one. So let's say a study found that people who dip snuff are 10 times more likely to get oral cancer than people who don't. Well, that's pretty strong evidence. Obviously, we'd still need to look at other things, but a strong association like that definitely gets our attention.
Right, it would make you say, hey, there's something really worth investigating here. I'm also remembering something about a dose-response relationship. Is that another one of the criteria?
You're on a roll. A dose-response relationship just means that the risk of the outcome goes up as the exposure increases. So in the case of snuff dipping, you might find that people who dip more often or have been dipping for a longer time have a higher risk of oral cancer compared to those who don't dip as much.
It's like the more you're exposed to something potentially harmful, the greater the chance of having negative consequences.
Yeah.
It really feels like we're putting together a case, step by step, using these different criteria to figure out if there's a real cause and effect connection.
Exactly. There are just a couple of other criteria that are mentioned in the podcast as well. There's specificity, which means that the exposure is only linked to one specific outcome, not a whole bunch of different ones. So if snuff dipping really does cause oral cancer, you wouldn't necessarily expect it to also cause lung cancer or heart disease.
So the link is specific to just that one outcome. It's not just causing all sorts of problems everywhere. What about that last criteria, reversibility?
Oh, yes, reversibility. This one looks at whether the risk of the outcome goes down if you take away the exposure. So if people who stop dipping snuff start to see a lower risk of oral cancer over time, well, that would support a causal link even more.
It's kind of like taking away the potential cause and then seeing if the problem starts to go away. It's really helpful to have all these criteria. It's like a checklist to help us figure out if a study might be pointing to a real cause and effect relationship. But even with all of this, can't bias still throw things off?
You're absolutely right. We've been talking about these criteria like they solve everything, but even if a study seems to tick all the boxes for causation, we can never be 100% sure that there isn't some hidden bias messing things up.
So even if we see a strong association, the timing is right, there's a biological explanation, and all those other pieces fit together, there's still a chance that bias could be lurking in the shadows. It feels like you can never be completely certain.
That's the challenge of science. It's a never-ending process of refining our understanding and being open to the idea that new information could come along and challenge what we thought we knew.
This is making me think about all the health headlines we see in the news. It's so easy to read a headline like, "Study finds link between X and Y," and assume that settles it. But as we've seen, there's so much more to consider.
You hit the nail on the head. It just shows how important it is to look beyond the headlines and dig deeper into the details of the research. Who were the people in the study? What were the methods used? Are there limitations?
And the most important one, what are all the other possible explanations for those findings? Could it be bias, confounding, chance? Or is there a real possibility of a true association?
You got it. Even then, it's always a good idea to keep a healthy dose of skepticism and remember that science is always evolving.
This deep dive has been so fascinating. We've covered a ton of information, but I'm really interested to hear what final thoughts you have for our listeners. Wow, what a journey this has been. Exploring the ins and outs of research and learning how to make sense of those sometimes confusing study results. It feels like we've been on an archaeological dig, carefully uncovering all those layers of complexity hidden beneath the surface.
And hopefully we've been able to shed some light on those 4 key possibilities that Dr. Hakimi talked about in his podcast: bias, confounding, chance, and that often hard to pin down true association.
We've learned that even the most straightforward findings can have a whole hidden story behind them, filled with potential problems and alternative explanations. But it's not about becoming a cynic or dismissing all research, right?
Right. It's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's about becoming more informed, more critical consumers of scientific information. Understanding that science is a process, a journey, not just a destination. It's about asking the right questions, thinking critically, and recognizing that what we know is constantly evolving.
So if some of our listeners are feeling a little overwhelmed by all of this, what's the key takeaway? What's the most important thing to remember when they're trying to navigate this complex world of information?
I think the most important thing is to keep in mind those 4 possibilities: bias, confounding, chance, and true association, and use them as a framework when you're evaluating research. So when you come across a new study, ask yourself, could bias be skewing the results? Is there a confounder that's not being considered? What's the role of chance?
It's like having this mental checklist that you can run through before jumping to any conclusions.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, you don't need to be a scientist or a statistician to do this. Critical thinking is a skill that anyone can learn and develop. It's all about being curious, being a little skeptical, and looking for solid evidence to back up the claims being made.
It reminds me of something you mentioned earlier, that science is a process. It's not about finding the answer and then closing the book. It's about constantly refining what we understand as new evidence emerges.
Exactly. And that means being open to new ideas, being willing to change our minds if the evidence warrants it, and recognizing that even long-held scientific beliefs can be challenged and changed over time.
That's a powerful thought. It's not about digging our heels in and defending our own beliefs, but about following the evidence wherever it leads.
You nailed it. And don't forget, when you're looking at scientific information, choosing reliable sources is super important. Always look for sources that are credible, unbiased, and transparent about their methods.
There's so much information and misinformation out there these days that it's more important than ever to be careful about where we're getting our information from.
I totally agree. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question to ponder.
I'm all ears.
Think back to that example we've been discussing, the connection between snuff dipping and oral cancer. Now, imagine you're a researcher and you want to design a study to prove or disprove this link once and for all. What would you do to minimize the influence of bias, confounding, and chance? How would you design your study to make sure you're getting the most reliable and convincing results possible?
Ooh, that's a great challenge. It really makes you put all these concepts we've been talking about into practice.
Exactly. I encourage all our listeners to really think about this question, jot down some ideas, chat about it with a friend, or even share your thoughts on social media.
Because in the end, the real goal of this deep dive isn't just to fill your head with information. It's about empowering you to become better critical thinkers, smarter consumers of information, and more engaged participants in the scientific process.
That's what it's all about. So until next time, keep those questions coming, keep searching for those answers, and never stop sharpening those critical thinking skills.
And remember, the world of research is always changing, so there's always something new to learn and explore. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.